Welcome, dear listener. The evening is settling around you, soft and slow, like the hush of a page turning. You've found your way to a quiet space, a story meant to wrap you in calm, to carry you toward the gentlest of dreams. There's no rush here, no sharp edges, no hurried footsteps, no heavy noise. Only the slow rhythm of a voice, the drifting candlelight of a story, and the feeling that you're safe, held, and welcome. Tonight's tale is a romance woven with paper and ink. A dream that began not in the daylight, but in the quiet margins of a writer's notebook. It's about Jude, a man who spent his nights alone in a little loft beneath the sloping eaves of an old building, writing words meant for no one but himself. In the open space between paragraphs, in the faint lines. At the edge of each page, he wrote dreams, small, secret dreams of a woman he'd never met. Not stories of grand passion or sweeping drama, no. These were tender, almost whispered moments, the warmth of someone's hand brushing against his in the dark, the faint scent of linen after rain, the sound of a voice, low and close, saying his name as though it had always belonged to her lips, and he never told anyone. These were his alone fragments of something that felt like memory, though he couldn't say why. It was in those margins that something unexpected began to stir. So, find a comfortable place. Let your body sink deeper into stillness. Breathe in slowly. And let the night carry you into Jude's quiet world. The loft was always quiet at night. From the street below came the faint hum of a late tram passing, a distant laugh that softened in the cold air, and then nothing but the stillness of old. Wood and ink, Jude sat at his desk beneath a single warm lamp. It wasn't much, just a circle of light, a stack of worn notebooks, and a pen that glided more slowly than most. He didn't rush when he wrote. He liked the pauses. The way silence seemed to pool between the words, the main body of his notebooks was filled with the stories he worked on, little vignettes, unfinished fragments, scenes of quiet towns and candlelit kitchens. But it was the edges of the pages that held his heart. The margins were wide, and he'd filled them over the years with dreams. Not all at once, a single line here, a short phrase there, as though each was a feather from some larger wing. He had yet to see. He wrote things like, her hair catches the lamplight like it remembers the sun. Or, she leaves a bookmark in the shape of a pressed violet. Or, her voice is softer in the morning, like a page turned before it's ready. He didn't know who she was. Perhaps no one. Perhaps someone who only existed when the pen touched the paper. But there was a constancy to her presence, a feeling that he was always writing toward her, even when she was nowhere in the scene. Outside, the city slowed. The air carried the scent of rain on stone. Jude leaned back, the chair creaking softly, and let his eyes drift toward the small window above the desk. The sky was deep pink, the stars hidden behind a haze, and yet there was a sense, almost a pull, as though something waited beyond. The glass. He bent over the page again, writing without thinking. She stands in the corner of the room, watching me write, as though she already knows the words. And then, just below it, in a smaller hand, she is patient, always patient. He exhaled, slowly, letting the words settle like dust across the page. The loft was utterly still, but in that stillness, Jude felt the faintest hum, as though the page itself had caught a breath. And then he smiled to himself, shaking his head. Just the long day, he thought, just the quiet playing tricks, still. Before setting down his pen, he added one more line in the margin. Someday she will read these words, and the thought of that, though impossible, warmed him in the way only imagined closeness can. Later that night, the rain began again. Not the hurried kind that rattles against glass, but a steady, silken fall, as though the whole city was wrapped in a curtain of sound. Jude had not yet gone to bed. He sat with his pen in hand, the lamp still casting its small golden halo, the world outside tucked far away. The pages before him were open to a fresh space, though his eyes wandered again to the margins. It had become a habit to glance at those quiet edges, to trace the lines of his own handwriting as if following a familiar path. The newest line someday, she will read these words, seemed to rest there with a kind of still pride. And then, something shifted. It was so slight that at first he thought it was a trick of the lamplight, the faint flicker that comes when electricity wavers. But the glow didn't fade, it deepened. The ink in the margins seemed to darken, rich and wet again, though he had written it hours before. Jude leaned closer. The faint scent of fresh ink rose from the page, impossibly real. And then, slowly, the edges began to shimmer, as though a thin band of moonlight had settled into the paper itself. He blinked, thinking perhaps fatigue was playing with his vision. But the shimmer grew, soft and steady, until the faint lines of his writing seemed almost alive. And then, a line began to appear on its own. The pen in his hand remained still, yet the letters unfolded in a slow, careful script, each stroke deliberate, as though someone somewhere was writing from the other side of the page. "I am reading them now." Jude's breath caught, but in the gentlest way, as if startled not by fear, but by something deeply tender. The handwriting was not his, the curves were looser, the letters leaning with a graceful slant. The page lay quiet again, but the glow lingered. Jude let his fingers hover above the words, not touching, but close enough to feel a faint warmth. He thought of all the dreams he had written in these margins. The imagined glances, the quiet gestures, the feeling of another presence in the room. And now, impossibly, that presence had answered. The rain outside softened further, a hush upon the hush. In the space between the sound of droplets, the loft seemed to hold its breath. Jude dipped his pen in ink. He didn't rush, he let the pause stretch, the way one might linger before replying to a voice that feels like a memory. Then, in the wide white space just below her line, he wrote, "Who are you?" For a moment, nothing moved. The lamp hummed faintly, the rain whispered, and then, slowly, more words began to write themselves beneath his own. "A friend you have always known." Jude leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth softening into a half smile. There was no fear in him, only a strange and familiar calm, as though this moment had been waiting in the quiet all along. He whispered into the room, though no one was there to hear it, or perhaps someone was, "I've been writing to you for a long time." The page remained still, but Jude could almost feel a reply forming in the air between heartbeats. Outside, the street lamp beyond his window flickered, its light catching in the drops of rain that slid slowly down the glass. The night felt different. Now not larger, but closer, as if it had drawn itself in around this desk, this lamp, this conversation written in light. Jude dipped his pen again, ready to see what would come next. The rain eased to a whisper, as though the clouds themselves had grown tired and were now resting. The air in the loft felt changed softer, as if each breath Jude took was shared with someone unseen. He had not moved from his desk. The notebook lay open, the ink still faintly glistening in the lamplight. No more words had appeared since her last. "A friend you have always known." He sat in that stillness for some time, letting the phrase linger. Somewhere inside him, it didn't feel like an introduction. It felt like the continuation of a conversation he'd been having in dreams. Over years he couldn't quite remember. Then, there was a shift, not in the paper, not in the ink, but in the air itself. From the corner of his eye, He noticed the window, a small square of glass framed by the dark eaves, seemed to hold a light that wasn't there before. Not the yellow-orange glow of the street lamp outside, but something softer, silver-tinged, like moonlight passing through water. He turned his head, and there she was. A woman stood just beyond the glass, her hair damp with the evening, her linen dress clinging lightly at the shoulders where raindrops had kissed it. She didn't knock, didn't call out. She simply looked in at him, her expression calm, almost curious. Dot in her hands. She held a notebook. Its cover was worn in the same places as his, its spine, softened by years of being opened and closed, had the same gentle bend, and along its edges, faint, glimmering writing curled in the margins, just like his own. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it was full, threaded with the recognition of something that went deeper than memory. Jude rose slowly, as though afraid any sudden movement might scatter this delicate thing that had found its way to him. He crossed the small space between desk and window, each step making the wood floor creak softly beneath him. When he reached the glass, she lifted her notebook slightly, tilting it so he could see a line written across its edge. "You've been writing to me too." A faint warmth rose in his chest, not the rush of surprise, but the gentler, steadier glow of finding something he hadn't realized he was missing. He unlatched the window. The cool night air drifted in, carrying the scent of rain-soaked stone and something else, something like pressed flowers tucked between the pages of a book. They stood close now, separated only by the wooden frame. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, low enough that it blended with the night. "I thought I was writing to no one," she said. Her eyes were steady, searching his, and yet there was no urgency, only quiet wonder. "So did I," Jude replied, his voice no more than a murmur. A drop of rain slid from her hair onto the page she held. It spread the ink slightly, turning one word into a soft blur, as though it too was becoming part of the night. She smiled, not a wide smile, but the kind that carried the whole warmth of a room in its curve. "May I come in?" Jude stepped back from the window. The invitation didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was already there, in the way he opened the space for her, in the way his lamp's light reached toward her across the sill when she stepped. Inside, she brought the cool damp of the night with her, and it mingled with the warm scent of ink and paper. Her presence filled the room without a sound, as though she had always belonged there. She set her notebook on his desk beside his own. For a moment, they simply looked at the two books lying open, side by side, the margins shimmering faintly. In unison, the words curling toward each other like vines across a garden wall. Jude realized with a quiet certainty that the woman from the margins was no longer made of ink alone. The loft felt warmer now, though neither of them had lit a fire or poured tea. It was a warmth that came from nearness, from the simple fact of someone else breathing beside you in a space that had, until now, been only yours. They stood over the desk together, the two notebooks lying open under the lamp's soft gold light. The margins shimmered faintly still, not as bright as when she had first appeared, but steady, as though the glow had settled into the pages themselves. Jude reached out and turned one of his own pages, careful not to touch hers, though. They were close enough that the backs of their hands nearly brushed. The new page revealed another of his quiet notes. "Her laughter is rare, but when it comes, it feels like light spilling over the edges of a cloud." She glanced at it, then smiled, not at the sentence itself, but at something deeper. Slowly, she turned a page of her own notebook. There, in her softer, looping script, was a line written long ago. "His laughter feels like sunlight breaking through rain." They both paused. The words were not the same, yet they mirrored each other, two sides Of the same thought, written years apart by hands that had never met, Jude turned another page. She leaves her scarf on the chair, not by accident. She turned one as well. He finds the scarf on the chair and pretends it was forgotten, so it will stay. A faint breath escaped him, more like a sigh than surprise. She looked at him then, her gaze steady and quiet. "How long have you been writing me?" she asked. He considered it, his fingers brushing the paper. "I don't know," he said softly. "It feels like always." Her smile was gentle, the kind that didn't ask for more. She reached for another page and laid her hand flat over the words as if keeping them warm. "I thought I was inventing you," she murmured. "A person to keep me company between the lines." Jude looked at her hand resting there, the way the lamplight caught the curve of her knuckles, the faint shadow her wrist made against the page. "I thought the same," he whispered. For a while they stood in silence, turning pages, finding little threads of recognition, a fragment of a shared dream here, a mirrored thought there. It was not the shock of discovery, but the peace of realizing something had been quietly true for a very long time. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean under a thin veil of mist. The window pane held small droplets that caught the lamplight, making it seem as though stars had drifted down to rest against the glass. She stepped away from the desk at last, moving toward the window. Her hand trailed along the back of his chair as she passed, the lightest touch, but enough to leave a small warmth in its wake. Jude joined her there, standing just close enough that their reflections in the glass almost merged. Neither of them spoke for some time, because there was no need. The quiet between them said everything. Somewhere deep inside, Jude felt it settle. He had not been writing into emptiness. Every word had been crossing a bridge neither of them could see. Until tonight, the days that followed slipped into a rhythm so natural that Jude couldn't remember when it had begun. The loft, once a place of solitary ink and lamplight, now held 2 chairs by the desk, 2 pens resting in the small ceramic cup, and 2 notebooks always lying open, waiting. They didn't speak much while they wrote. Words came in the quiet, and the quiet felt like a shared language. Sometimes their hands would move at the same pace, the faint scratch of pen against paper forming a soft duet. Other times, one would pause to watch the other's hand move, as though listening for a melody they both knew by heart. The margins, once Jude's private territory, no longer his alone. Now her script wandered freely across his pages, curling in silvered ink that seemed to glow faintly when the light caught it, and his handwriting appeared in hers, winding between her lines like a vine finding its way along a trellis. It wasn't planned. They never agreed on what to write, or who would start, or how a page should look when it was finished. But somehow each margin found the other, and the 2 voices became one, sometimes meeting in a single sentence, sometimes weaving around each other like strands of the same thought. On one page in Jude's notebook, her words curved gently at the top. "There is a cup of tea waiting for him in the kitchen, though he doesn't know it yet." And just below, his writing appeared. "He will find it by the window, steam curling into the morning, and know that it was meant for him." On another page in hers, he had written, "She keeps the window open at night, so the wind can bring him dreams." And beneath it, her reply flowed without hesitation. "They always find him." The days themselves were unhurried. Sometimes they would walk through the narrow streets together, their steps unspokenly in sync. Other times they stayed in, letting the world turn without them, the pages between them filling slowly, like a garden in spring. When evening came, they would sit at the desk once more. The lamplight would pool over their hands, and the rain, when it came, would tap gently at the glass as though it too was reading along. There was no rush to their closeness. It was not the kind that demanded declarations or hurried promises. It was the quiet, enduring kind that grew in layers, the kind that felt like home long before anyone called it that. One night, as the hours slipped past midnight, Jude noticed her head leaning slightly toward his shoulder as she wrote. The curve of her hair brushed his sleeve. She didn't move away when the sentence was finished. Neither did he. The page before them held only a single shared line that night. We are here, and it was enough. The loft seemed quieter than ever that evening, though the city beyond its windows was still moving in its slow, nighttime way. Somewhere far below, a door closed. Somewhere farther still, a bicycle wheel whispered across damp cobblestones. But up here in the lamplight, the world felt very far away. Jude and the woman whose name he realized he had never actually asked sat side by side at the desk. The air between them was warm with the scent of paper and the faintest trace of rain that clung to her linen sleeves. The notebooks lay open, their pages full now with a tangle of shared words. Some pages shimmered faintly still, as if reluctant to fade. Others simply rested, their ink settled, their voices quiet for now. Her hand moved slowly over the paper, the nib of her pen pausing between each word as though choosing them with care. Jude watched without hurry, his own pen resting against the page. When she reached the end of the line, she didn't lift her pen entirely. She lingered there, the ink gathering at the tip, the sentence waiting. He leaned slightly closer, just enough to see what she had written. Some dreams don't need to end. Beneath it, there was space for his reply. He could have written anything, a question, an answer, a word to seal the thought. But instead, he wrote only, "Some dreams become the air we breathe." She looked at the words, her gaze steady. A small, quiet smile touched her lips. She placed her pen down beside his, the two lying parallel on the desk like they had always belonged. Together, outside, the mist had deepened into a soft silver fog, wrapping the buildings and street lamps in a gauzy stillness. The glass of the window blurred the city into shapes and glows, making it seem as if they were no longer in a place, but inside a dream itself. Jude closed his notebook gently, and she mirrored the motion. For a moment, neither of them moved to put them away. The covers touched, their edges aligned, and it felt complete. They sat there a little longer, the lamplight dimming as the oil in its base settled lower. Her hand, resting on the desk, turned slightly until her fingers found his. It was a light touch, almost weightless, but it carried all the softness of the pages they had written together. He didn't look at her when he curled his fingers gently around hers, and she didn't look at him. They both looked ahead, toward the quiet, toward whatever might come after this moment, though neither needed to name it. In the very last page of Jude's notebook, there was one more margin, still blank. She reached for her pen once more, her movements slow, deliberate, as though each second was something to be savored. Her script curved into the space, graceful and sure, but she stopped before the sentence could be completed. It ended mid-thought, the ink tapering to a fine point, as if it were not a pause at all, but an opening. They both looked at it, and in the silence it felt right that it would never be finished. Some words, like some dreams, were meant to linger. The lamp flickered once more, its glow stretching thin, and the fog outside seemed to press closer to the glass. Their hands remained joined on the desk. The air around them felt deep and still, like the space between heartbeats. And as the night held them, the unfinished line in the margin rested there, a breath caught in ink, waiting perhaps for another evening, another quiet, another dream.